I came across the idea of growing orchids in water about 5 years ago, and my initial reaction was complete horror. Why would anybody use this technique? I've been growing orchids for over 40 years, and one of the things that kills orchids more than anything else is overwatering. And yet, here's a group of people who say, put the roots in water, and they grow great. That's just crazy. Or is it? Now, there are pictures online of people growing these orchids in water, and they're doing a really good job. So it's certainly possible to grow orchids in water. The question we really should ask is, are there advantages to doing it that way? Is it better to grow in water than in, say, cocoa husk, which is what I use? So in this program, I'm going to look at the pros and cons of growing orchids in water, and I'm going to also report on some experiments I did, because I did try growing them in different ways in different amounts of water. And then I'll give you my final opinion about whether or not you should try this technique. What is orchid water culture? In simple terms, it is growing orchids in more water, and there are three main techniques. Full water culture, semi-water culture, semi-hydroponics. Based on how freely people use these terms, you would think they are well defined, but they're not. These are the more common versions of the methods. The first method is full water culture. The word full in this name is a bit misleading because in most cases the roots are not fully submersed in water. Most people will submerge only 2/3 of the roots or even 1/3 of them. The key to this method is that some part of the root is always in water. It is common when starting a new orchid with this technique to have the roots sit above the water line and let them grow into the water slowly. The second method is semi-water culture. This technique has the roots sitting in water for a few days, and then the water is removed so the roots can dry out. This is then followed by a couple of days in water. This wet-dry cycle can be 2 days wet and 5 days dry, which is the most common, or 5 days wet and 2 days dry, or any other variation that suits you. The third method is semi-hydroponic culture. This technique is even more variable. There is some inert material in the jar with some water. The inert material can be leca clay, pebbles, pumice, or stones. The water level can be at any height, and it can even be drained periodically to give the plant a dry period. From an orchid's perspective, this method is really the same as the above two techniques, so I will ignore it in the rest of this discussion. Most epiphytic orchids can be grown with water culture, but the focus has been mostly on the moth orchid, the Phalaenopsis, which is by far the most popular homegrown orchid. The main question to ask is, does water culture work? There is no doubt it works. Plants are very adaptable, and you can grow them a lot of different ways. Based on the pictures that I have seen, flowering is better in pot culture than in water culture, but there are certainly some good examples of really well-grown plants in water culture. Rather than ask, does it work, we should ask the following. Is water culture better than traditional pot culture? And is it an easy method to use? There seems to be a lot of interest in this technique, so I figured there must be some good reasons why people are trying it. I asked for reasons in a Facebook group that is mostly dedicated to water culture and only got 3 answers. I then went looking at blog posts that promote the method and found almost no claimed benefits. Here is the total list of what I found. Fewer fungus gnats, fewer pests, less work, and easier to monitor root problems. I also found this statement, water culture mimics the natural way orchids grow. That is nonsense. In nature, epiphytic orchids get rained on and then dry quickly. Some do grow in tropical areas, but even in rainy seasons when it rains all day, the roots do not sit in water because they are mostly running vertically along tree trunks. They are wet but not submerged in water. To understand these claimed benefits, we have to compare them to the traditional way of growing orchids, which is in bark or more commonly coconut husk. Sphagnum is also used, but it is a more difficult media for beginners, and I don't recommend it because it kills too many plants. Culture in coconut husk is simple. You repot every 2 years, which takes 10 minutes, and you water and fertilize once a week, which takes less than 5 minutes. There are detailed videos on orchid culture at my Garden Fundamentals YouTube channel. Let's look at the claims in detail. Water culture has fewer fungus gnats. I am not sure why this claim is made. Properly water orchids in traditional pots don't have fungus gnats. I've grown hundreds of orchids over a 40-year period, and fungus gnats were never a problem. I guess water culture has less than 0 fungus gnats. The second claim is that water culture has fewer pests. The most common pests on orchids are mealybugs and scale. Both of these live on the foliage and not in the potting media. There are root mealybugs that do live in soil, but I have never seen them in orchid potting media. Neither of these insects crawl very far, and transmission is usually plant to plant. When plant leaves touch the pest, will move from one plant to the next. That does not change with water culture, so this is also a false claim. Water culture is claimed to be less work. Full water culture is less work. You can leave the plant for a month between watering, but you also have to wash out the glass container from time to time, which adds work. I spend 5 minutes per plant per week. Do you really need to reduce this time? Semi-water culture is more work than using potting media. It is easier to monitor root problems with water culture. This is a valid benefit of water culture. You can easily see the roots, and any problems can be dealt with right away. To some extent, the use of clear pots also lets you see the roots in potted plants, but most of the roots are still hidden by the media. Since rotting roots are the #1 killer of orchids in potting media, seeing them is certainly an advantage. However, if you water correctly and you repot every 2 years, rotting roots are rarely a problem. If the leaves are showing problems, it is easy enough to lift the plant out of the pot and examine the roots. The only real benefit of water culture seems to be the ability to see the roots. What about the negative aspects of water culture? Nobody seems to talk about this, but there are some significant problems with this technique. It is difficult to support plants. It is a slow process to get plants used to water culture. The roots are removed from the plant to start the process, and fertilizing is more difficult in full water culture. Let's have a look at each of these negatives in more detail. It is difficult to support plants. Root tips are tender, and banging them around is not good for them. The normal media in a pot holds the plant in place so it does not move, and you can easily add rhizome clips after repotting to hold the plant very steady while it forms new roots. Orchids in water culture are sitting in an open vessel, and there is nothing to hold them in place. Phalaenopsis have horizontal leaves that keep the plant from falling into the container, but other orchids grow more vertically, and then you need to rig some wire or string to hold them up. In both cases, they move around whenever you replace the water or lift the container. Staking flower stems is also more difficult in water culture than in pot culture. The second negative, it's a slow process to get plants used to water culture. You first cut off old roots because air roots will rot in water. They can be fully removed or just shortened so they don't make contact with water. As new roots form, they slowly touch the water as they get longer. If you spend some time on orchid water culture forums, you see that many people struggle to get their orchids growing in water for both full water and semi-water culture. It is not a simple process, especially for an orchid beginner. Getting an orchid used to water culture can take 6 to 12 months. Many plants will lose the lower leaves during the process to compensate for the loss of roots. This delays flowering until the plant can get strong enough again. Compare that to pot culture. Pot up the orchid and water correctly, that's it. I have even done it when the plant was in flower without harming it, although I try to avoid that. What about removing roots at the start of the process? In water culture, it is critical to remove any dead or diseased roots because they rot in water. Some people actually suggest cutting off all roots, which does tremendous damage to the plant. It is claimed that the orchid needs to make so-called water roots. I don't know if this is true. Water culture roots don't look any different, but there may be some internal structural or chemical differences. The only study on orchid water culture that I found suggests that special water roots do develop. In pot culture, you can clean up the roots a bit and remove dead ones while repotting them, but even that is not a requirement. The plant will take care of root pruning on its own. Fertilizing is more difficult in full water culture. I have done a full review of orchid fertilizer myths in an article called Orchid Fertilizer Myths Grow More Flowers. It can be found at gardenmyths.com. They need more fertilizer than orchid experts have been recommending, but they are also harmed by too much. How do you fertilize in water culture? In the semi-culture method, you can dump the water and replace it with new water containing the right amount of nutrients. But in full culture, you never know how many nutrients you have in the water. As water evaporates, it concentrates the unused fertilizer. As roots absorb nutrients, the level goes down. You have no idea how much is in the water, and therefore you don't know if you need to add more. Under-fertilizing results in smaller plants and fewer flowers. Over-fertilizing can kill the plant. In pot culture, the excess fertilizer is washed out the bottom of the pot, with the next watering making fertilizing much easier. I decided to give full water culture a try. I moved one of my phals into full water culture following the most common instructions. The roots kept rotting as soon as they spent too much time underwater. The plant moved every time I picked up the container. That can't be good for new root tips. At the end of 6 months, leaves were shriveled and it was dying from lack of roots. I would never recommend this method. I also tried semi-water culture. I put another phal into semi-water culture so that it has about an inch of water in the bottom. It does dry out from time to time, but there is usually some water in the bottom. The roots and container were all green, covered with algae. The plant did okay, and it just started opening some flower buds. It did not grow as many leaves as other plants grown in media. It did have some root rot, but not as much as in full water culture. I didn't empty the water every few days. That's too much work. I just let it evaporate and then replace it. That might build up salts in the container, but so far it has not been a problem. I would not recommend this method either, but it does work, and it is easier to get an orchid used to the conditions. What I would do is put the orchid in the jar and just put 1/4 inch of water in the bottom. When this dries up, add some more. Slowly increase the level to a couple of inches. It is also a good idea to dump out the water periodically to prevent salt buildup. Here are the results of a third test. This orchid was grown by someone else asking for help on the internet. It has been in water culture for a year, and now they are concerned about the yellowing leaves. The lower half of the root system is rotting. You can clearly see the water line where the rot starts. With fewer roots, the plant can't support the leaves, so it is dropping most of them. Normally, a phal will lose one leaf at a time as it grows a new one. But when a plant loses a lot of roots, it also drops most of the leaves to keep the plant in balance. The pictures posted for this plant show a few flowers, but the flower stem has not developed properly given the size of the plant. This is typical of what I see online from new orchid growers trying to use water culture. Should you use water culture for orchids? I think the answer is very clear. No. There are almost no benefits to using this technique, and there are significant reasons why you shouldn't use the technique. I think what's happened here is that we have a lot of people who've tried growing orchids and had problems. Plants just rotted away. So they're looking for a better way to grow orchids. And they stumble across this technique and they see, well, it looks really simple. A lot of people have grown other types of houseplants in water. I mean, who hasn't taken a cutting from a plant and stuck it in a jar of water and it roots and it grows really well? It's such a simple technique. So why not try it for orchids? Well, there's a very good reason for that. The roots of orchids are very different than other houseplants. The structure is completely different. Orchid roots need lots of air. They don't get that when submerged in water. The American Orchid Society doesn't even mention this technique on their website. And in fact, I spoke to one of the executives and I asked her, what is your feeling about this technique? She had never even heard of it. And yet she's been growing orchids for many years. This is not a technique that people use for growing orchids, except for a very fringe group of people. And yes, you can be successful, but the chances of you being successful is quite low. Instead, use cocoa husk. Follow my techniques and you will be successful with orchids. They're really easy to grow. Now, if you want to know how to pot up an orchid properly, have a look at this video right here. And if you want to see all of my orchid growing videos, hop on over here. Happy gardening.